Part 86. Injuring the Messenger of Allah. After the Muslims dispersed, the Prophet was surrounded by 9 companions: Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, Talha ibn Ubaydillah, and 7 of the Ansar. They realized that 10 people could not withstand the imminent attack, so they fled together up the mountains. They utilized their home advantage, as they were well acquainted with the surrounding mountainous terrains, while the Meccan opposition were not. They sought refuge in a small crevice within a mountain, and as a group of the enemy were nearing, the Prophet asked his companions, "Who will take on these people and will be my companion in paradise?" Talha immediately offered himself, but the Prophet instructed him to remain beside him. An Ansari then offered, and the Prophet allowed him to go forth. The Ansari was martyred, and another volunteered, and this continued until only the Prophet alongside Talha and Sa'd remained. Qatada ibn al-Nu'man al-Awsi narrated that the Prophet handed him a bow to use. He used the bow so much that it lost its flexibility, so he used his body to shield the Prophet from oncoming arrows. He then said,
"I saw an arrow that I could not stop except with my face, so I blocked the Prophet with my face, and the arrow hit my eye."
When the Prophet saw this, he began to cry and said, "O Allah, Qatada has protected your Prophet with his face, so let his eye become the most precise eye." The Prophet took the arrow out, and Qatada swore that it instantaneously healed, so much so that it became more precise than his other eye. Talha and Sa'd were expert archers, so they continued to thwart off attacks. As the Prophet would look out to try and assess, Talha would say,
"My chest instead of your chest, O Messenger of Allah."
The Prophet handed arrows to Sa'd, saying, "May my mother and father be ransomed for you. Fire away, O Sa'd." The phrase, "May my mother and father be ransomed for you," is the highest expression of respect in classical Arabic, meaning, "I would sacrifice my own parents for you." The companions would frequently address the Prophet with this phrase. However, this was the first and only time that the Prophet ever used the expression to anyone, and Sa'd would very proudly remember this unique honor. The situation escalated, and the Prophet was injured. First, a rock hit the Prophet in the face, causing his lip to bleed. Then an arrow hit him in his face, penetrating his face guard and knocking out an incisor tooth. Finally, a rider struck the Prophet with his sword. Talha partially blocked the strike with his shield, but the sword still made impact on the Prophet's helmet, the force of which formed a gash in the Prophet's face which caused blood to gush out. This was perhaps the most critical moment in the entire Seerah. The Prophet described Ta'if as the most distressing event of his life, but that was emotional trauma. The people of Ta'if did not try to kill him. As for this moment, the Prophet was an arrow away from death. The Prophet then bemoaned, "How can Allah forgive them when they wound their Prophet?" Later, Allah corrected this statement.
"You have no say in the matter. It is up to Allah to turn to them in mercy or punish them, for indeed they are wrongdoers." Surah 3, verse 128.
Despite being the best of all creation, Allah is the only one who decides who can be forgiven. The Prophet may call them wrongdoers, but forgiveness and punishment is in the hands of the Creator. After this verse was revealed, the Prophet said, "O Allah, forgive my people, for they do not know." Indeed, many of them were forgiven, namely Khalid ibn al-Walid, who led the entire attack but was to eventually become known as the Sword of Allah, for leading the Muslims to unprecedented military success. Rumors spread that the Prophet was killed, and the Quraysh began to celebrate. Ironically, it perhaps saved the Prophet, as the Quraysh began to withdraw after they thought that they killed the Messenger of Allah. Some Muslims were in disarray, some walked around aimlessly, and others slumped to the ground. Anas ibn al-Nadir, the uncle of Anas ibn Malik, passed by a group of disillusioned Muslims, berating them for not fighting. They replied,
"Haven't you heard? The Prophet has been killed."
He responded,
"Even if the Prophet has been killed, the Lord of the Prophet has not been killed. Besides, what will you do with your life after the death of the Prophet? Let us go and die as he died."
Anas marched forth towards the enemy and turned to his friend Sa'd ibn Mu'ad and said,
"O Saad, I can smell paradise from behind that mountain."
He then walked forward and said,
"O Allah, I ask forgiveness for what these men, that is, the Muslims failing to protect the Prophet, have done, and I disassociate from what they, the Quraysh, have done."
He then threw himself into the battle and killed as many of the enemy as he could. Eventually, the Muslims found a body with over 80 wounds from head to toe, and they could not identify the body until Anas's sister recognized him from his fingertips. Allah then revealed about him,
Among the believers are men who have proven true to what they pledged to Allah. Some of them have fulfilled their pledge with their lives, and others are waiting their turn. They never changed in the least. Surah 33, verse 23.
The battle eventually ended, and the Muslims began regrouping. Ka'b ibn Malik was the first to notice the Prophet, and he screamed,
"O Muslims, rejoice! The Prophet is alive!"
The arrow and piece of metal were both still stuck inside the Prophet's face, and as Abu Bakr went to remove them, Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah begged Abu Bakr to allow him the honor. He kept begging him until Abu Bakr, soft-hearted as he was, relented. The piece of metal was lodged so deeply in the Prophet's face that it could not be pulled out with one's fingers, so Abu Ubaidah then bit down to dislodge it, and he bit so hard that his own tooth fell out in the process. He then repeated the action with the second piece of metal and lost another tooth. Abu Ubaidah would smile proudly knowing that his teeth were sacrificed for the Prophet. The Quraysh still believed that the Prophet had died, so Abu Sufyan was seen from a distance standing on one of the mountains of Uhud. He yelled at the top of his voice,
"Is Muhammad alive?"
The Prophet instructed the companions, "Do not answer him." He asked again but was met with silence. He then asked,
"Is the son of Abu Quhafa, Abu Bakr, alive?"
The Prophet instructed them not to answer. He then asked,
"Is the son of Al-Hattab, Umar, alive?"
The Prophet instructed them not to answer. Note that even Abu Sufyan, leader of the enemy, recognized that Abu Bakr and Umar were the Prophet's closest confidants and were first and second in command. Abu Sufyan then began boasting,
"We have killed all of them."
Umar could no longer contain himself and retorted,
"You have lied, O enemy of Allah. Indeed, Allah has caused all of them to live, and they will remain to harm you at another date."
Successful in his bait, Abu Sufyan responded,
"Today was in response to Badr, and war alternates."
He continued,
"You shall find amongst the dead mutilated bodies. I did not command this, but I'm not angry about it either."
Umar responded,
Badr and Uhud are not the same. Our dead are in paradise, and your dead are in hellfire.
Abu Sufyan then yelled,
"Hubal be honored."
The Prophet then ordered Umar to respond. Umar asked how to respond, and the Prophet instructed, "Allah is greater and mightier." Abu Sufyan again retorted,
"We have Al-Uzza, the idol, and you have no Uzza, honor."
The Prophet again instructed Umar to respond.
Allah is our protector, and you have no protector.
Ibn al-Qayyim aptly notes that the Prophet instructed the companions not to respond when they were being insulted, but as soon as Allah was insulted and polytheism was being venerated, he ordered them to respond. As always, the Prophet prioritized the religion of Allah over himself.